Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Dr. Bartabedian, thank you for such kind remarks. I am so grateful for the University Foundation and Dr. Bedian and Jerry Pickman and his staff, their support in continuing these convocations, which have been something for the last 22 years. I extend a special welcome to the students and those of you attending your first convocation, and for those of you who have been here before, welcome back. And I should add that when we started this convocation 22 years ago, more than anything else, this is for the students. And so I'm glad the students are here, and I hope that what you hear today is something that you'll take with you. It's part of the educational process, and I hope it helps. And I look forward to you hearing these remarks today. We're bringing you another high-profile national speaker, this being a convocation on critical issues. In considering this year's speaker, we wanted to focus on the growing threat of terrorism, both at home and abroad. I thought the timing was particularly appropriate. As you know, terrorism is not isolated to the Middle East with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It has been exported to other countries, including our country. As we watch beheadings, suicide bombings, attacks on our own soil, other atrocities, and a refugee crisis unfolding like anything we have seen since World War II, terrorism has become a growing concern to all of us. Cyber attacks are yet another concern. Our freedoms are under siege. We are engaged in a war, an asymmetrical war, on terrorism, and it is a war our children and our grandchildren will wage. It is a war that in all probability will last decades. And it is a war that we absolutely must win. Henry Kissinger said, "The conventional army loses if it does not win. The guerrilla wins if he does not lose." That can be applied to terrorism and the lone wolves. None of us want to live in fear. We live in a country that has many capabilities to confront this threat and to keep us safe. But today's realities prompt concerns and require extra vigilance. It is, and it will be, a test of our resolve as citizens in this country. So how should we address these concerns? There are few, if any, who can bring more expertise to this topic than our speaker today. Tom Ridge was our first Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and served that capacity from 2003 to 2005. Prior to becoming a cabinet secretary beginning in 2001, he served as the first assistant to President George Bush from Homeland Security. He was called in by our president following the events of September 11. President Bush then asked Governor Ridge to come to Washington to develop and coordinate a comprehensive national strategy to strengthen protections against terrorist attacks and attacks in the United States. His first duties included organizing the Office of Homeland Security and the Homeland Security Council. In recognizing Secretary Ridge for his service as the nation's first Homeland Security Advisor and first Secretary of Homeland Security, President Bush said this: "In the fight against terrorism, he played a vital role in protecting the American people from a real and ongoing threat. America is safer and our government is better able to protect our people because of his hard work." Born August 26, 1945 in Pittsburgh's Steel Valley, Governor Ridge was raised in a working-class family in veterans public housing in Erie, Pennsylvania. He earned a scholarship to Harvard, graduating with honors in 1967. After his first year at the Dickinson School of Law, he was drafted into the U.S. Army, where he served as an infantry staff sergeant in Vietnam, earning the Bronze Star for Valor, the Combat Infantry Badge, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. The veterans of foreign wars have bestowed upon Governor Ridge their highest honor, the Dwight D. Eisenhower Award. After returning to Pennsylvania following his military service, he earned his law degree and was in private practice before becoming a distinguished assistant district attorney in Erie County. He then was elected to Congress from Pennsylvania in 1982. He was the first enlisted Vietnam combat veteran elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and was overwhelmingly reelected by Pennsylvania voters 5 times. This is unusual. Throughout his political career, Tom Ridge has never, ever lost an election. After more than 25 years in public service, Governor Ridge now heads several consulting firms, including the Ridge Policy Group in Washington, D.C., which provides consultation on security and risk-related matters and governmental affairs. He also serves on several public and private boards, including the Institute for Defense Analysis and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce National Security Task Force. He has maintained his interest in matters concerning veterans, and along with General Tommy Franks, serves as National Co-Chairman of the Flight 93 Memorial. You saw it this week. The memorial was dedicated in Shanksville, Pennsylvania last Thursday, and Friday, once again, they observed that memorial, and Governor Ridge was there. He has been awarded honorary degrees from Carnegie Mellon University, Bucknell University, Lafayette College, Elizabeth College, and the University of Utah. His honors include the Woodrow Wilson Award, the John F. Kennedy National Award, and many others. He authored the book, The Test of Our Times, America Under Siege, and How We Can Be Safe Again. He regularly addresses audiences throughout the world on issues such as security, terrorism, and global engagement. He and his wife, Michelle, the former executive director of the Erie County Library System, reside in Washington, D.C., and have 2 children. Today, he favors us with his presence, and I am pleased to present him to you. I have really been looking forward to this. Would you please join me in extending a warm Missouri welcome to a distinguished combat veteran and a great American, Tom Ridge.
That was overly generous, but I thank you so very much. Real kind. Thank you. Thank you
Go
very
get
much.
them.
I will do it. That's excellent. Thank you. Well, I certainly want to thank you for that overly generous introduction, and thank you very much for your very warm applause and reception. It's been a pleasure spending some time with students and faculty. We spent a little time last night, watched the Cronkite program. What a wonderful way to learn history through the eyes and the voice and the intellect of one of America's most trusted journalists. It's fascinating, and I had a chance this morning to spend some time with some of the students at the school, interact with them. So it's great to be here. It's great to be, I was never much of an athlete, so when I get a chance to address somebody on a basketball court, it makes me feel pretty good. I got to tell you, on my jump shot, it's tough to get a nickel, but obviously you got some pretty good basketball players around here and some pretty good athletes, so it's a pleasure to join you in this venue. I saw a couple of people last night. There was a high school teacher by the name, I think, Chris Kelly. Any students here? Professor Chris Kelly? I know there's some students here. All right, I was going to try to get you a little extra credit. Where are you? All right, listen, I told the teacher that I thought he ought to give you extra credit for showing up. So thank you for that. Maybe even more credit if you write a little report if you learn anything. If you don't learn anything, don't send anything in. But nice to have you here. Nice to have you here. Mr. Boulware? Mr. Boulware? Nice to be with your dad. Pretty proud of his son. So is everybody in the school. Mr. President, you have been a warm and gracious host, and so have all your members of your faculty and the student body, and I thank you for the wonderful invitation. If you listen to the introduction, you could probably say the guy can't hold a job. And I have been blessed all my life with opportunities to serve, starting with my time as a soldier and as a prosecutor and all the way to a cabinet secretary. So I'm very pleased to maybe rely on some of those experiences that I've had and offer some ideas to you today that hopefully are relevant maybe to not only the academic discussions that you have, but more importantly, just as citizens of this great country. Because I do think we want for a more engaged body politic. I know there's a lot of disappointment with what appears to be a dysfunctional enterprise called federal government. Parties can't seem to get along. Compromise seems to be a dirty word, and problems linger. Much discussion about the problem, very few solutions. So if nothing else, during the course of this conversation I'd like to have with you, perhaps contributing to a better understanding of the challenges associated with one of the two phenomenon that I think are affecting particularly the younger generation, but all generations for the foreseeable future, and that's the global scourge of terrorism. If not enlighten or inform and educate, maybe at least draw your interest into paying a little bit more attention to what goes on at the national, state, and even local level. Now, people have asked me about the transition from all my time in public service to the private sector, and I must tell you it was fairly easy. I remember walking to my vehicle midnight, the last night I served as Secretary of Homeland Security. I was on the job till midnight. And on the way out the door, the Secret Service leader said to me, "Mr. Secretary, it's been a pleasure serving you. Good night and good luck." I got the good night part. I wasn't quite sure what the good luck was all about. It hit me the next day. Now remember, I was in government service, and the state police provided my protection and my travel arrangements when I was governor. By the way, I was governor for 6 years, 9 months, and 5 days, but who's counting? Best job in America, being governor. And then the Secret Service provided my transportation when I was secretary. I woke up the next morning. I want to go get a cup of coffee, and I want to walk through the Montgomery Mall by myself, unescorted, like a normal citizen. I have no car. We have 2 cars in the family. My wife has 1 car, and my son and daughter are going to a school. I had leased a car, and they had that car. So my plans were postponed for a while until that afternoon. My son and daughter came home from high school, and I said to my son, "Tommy, Dad would like to borrow the car." Now, I want you to have a little empathy if you're college and high school students here, but a father asking a son and daughter to borrow their car is a little unusual, you have to admit. So my son kind of gave me the look, like, "You want to borrow my car?" I said, "Dad is leasing the bloody thing. Give me the keys." So he flipped me the keys. He's a good young man. He's got a great sense of humor. And he said, "Don't forget 2 things. I said, "What's that, son?" He said, "Watch where you park it. And don't forget to fill it up with gas before you bring it home." So I've done that. I finally got a vehicle. I travel around trying to build a small company, involved in many charitable enterprises. And for those of you out there in business, one of my charities that I work on, I chair the board of directors of the National Organization on Disability. So the next time you're looking to hire somebody, look past the disability and identify the ability. All these men and women want a chance. So just a little aside, it's a little political advertisement I get in front of any audience of potential employees. So I've made that transition, and now as a private citizen, I get a chance to speak my mind. So you're going to get unvarnished opinion from me with regard to these things, and whether you agree or disagree is up to you, but the beautiful part of it is it's the First Amendment, it's its Constitution, and that's relevant to our discussion because as we are challenged by the global scourge of terrorism, we have to understand that our response has to be consistent with the rule of law, consistent with our Constitution, consistent to how we are viewed in the rest of the world as an exceptional country because of the Constitution and because of a rule of law. But before I get into that, I want to just address a couple of comments to the young people in this room. I forgot to recognize the distinguished faculty, and I thank you for your commitment to the university and the education of these students here. By the way, I'm amazed that you're here, and I thank you for that. Politics and government is really about tomorrow, if you think about it. The decisions that elected officials today allegedly are to make sure that tomorrow is a better day. There's a Native American expression that I often used as governor. It says, you don't inherit the earth from your ancestors, you borrow it from your children. Think about that for a moment. In an environmental context, I think we know what that means. The environment's a pretty fragile place. You've got to preserve it. And your job is to make sure you not only preserve it, but maybe you can even enhance it because you borrowed it from your kids. And I believe the same thing applies to economic opportunity and safety and security concerns. Your job today is to make sure, my generation's job is to make sure that your future is a little brighter, a little better, a little safer. But I'm not sure we've done a particularly good job in that regard. My son and daughter in their late 20s, and I'm not sure they've got, because of the nature of global competition, the global challenges in foreign policy, and a lot of other factors, their world is a lot more complicated than mine. And so I'm not sure we're going to give them, pass on to them. Remember, I haven't inherited, I'm giving it back to my kids. Is as good and as strong and as safe, as opportunistic as it should be. And I say that to you young people in the audience. You have more tomorrows than I do. If politics and government is tomorrow, look at the calendar. You look at my calendar, you have more tomorrows than I do. And so if you forget anything from my speech, and if you remember one thing, forget the rest of the thing I say, but you remember one thing, let me encourage you to do this. Spend a little time paying attention to the issues. Be an informed citizen. I don't mean you have to get involved in politics. Just take a little time to keep yourself informed, because they are your tomorrows. And vote. Vote. If the only thing you do is vote as an informed citizen, if you just accept that mantle of responsibility, it's not a privilege, folks, it's a responsibility. But more importantly, it's your future. And hopefully, as I share some thoughts with you today about the impact of terrorism on your future, one, you'll better understand it. By the way, we'll deal with it. This is the United States of America. We can handle this scourge, but we need to understand it. We need to understand the complications associated with how we respond to it in a way that's consistent with our value system. But never forget, politics and government is about tomorrow. You have more tomorrows than any faculty member. You certainly have more tomorrows than I do. Think about it, try to stay informed, and vote. And I don't mean just nationally. Pay attention to your local leaders, your state leaders, and everybody else. Enough preaching to the choir. Enough preaching. Happy anniversary, 100 years here, right? Happy anniversary of this great university. Congratulations. One of the legitimate criticisms that came in my direction after President Bush asked me to become the Special Assistant for Homeland Security was that I was not a counterterrorism expert. And it was legitimate criticism or comment, because I wasn't. And I'm still not. But I've learned a lot along the way. Kind of drank from a fire hose the first couple months and been learning ever since, and I continue to learn. I spent 4 days last week in Israel with the Institute for Counterterrorism. If you talk about a tragic and challenging petri dish dealing with counterterrorism, Israel's the place, 24/7, all the time. I got back on Thursday night, and then I went to Shanksville on Friday morning. Been there 10 out of the last 14 years. It's a real special place. It's a living memorial. I was there about 5 or 6 hours after the plane went down. I was home in Erie, Pennsylvania, giving donuts to my mom, who was in the hospital at the time. She didn't like breakfast in the hospital, so I got her some donuts. And on the way back home, coming up the driveway, the state police told me there are a couple planes just hit the Twin Towers. I went in, called my operations center, talked to my chief of staff, got everybody in our ops center. Finally made my way back to the state capitol at Harrisburg, hopped in a big Chinook, one of those big Army helicopters, and flew into Shanksville. Now, I was expecting to see the wreckage of a commercial aviation accident. Beats of the engine, fuselage, wings, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, I can close my eyes, I can see it now. There's nothing there except a smoldering hole. They think it went in the ground inverted over 500 miles an hour. It's a beautiful place in Pennsylvania. It's a beautiful setting, very rural. Hardly any houses around, any barns around, nothing there. A beautiful, unsuspecting place is the resting place of passengers and crew of Flight 93. So I've got multiple perspectives I bring to our discussion this morning, and I'm honored and grateful that you've given me an opportunity to share them with you. There is no question that we were forever changed by the events of 9/11. It's a new enemy. It's a new reality. I would argue, at least for the foreseeable future, I think it's a permanent condition. I think this country, particularly young people, but all of us are going to deal with two permanent changes in our world. One is the Internet of everything. We are hyper-connected. That's good, that's bad. The ubiquity of the Internet is its strength. The ubiquity of the Internet is its weakness. We are hyper-connected. We're going to have to deal with that. And the other challenge is the global scourge of terrorism. We're going to be dealing with that for decades, maybe forever. Because one of the things that 9/11 showed us was it doesn't take too much money or too many people to bring horror and tragedy as a result of their willful, deliberate, and premeditated action. It doesn't take much. And as long as you have zealots who buy into that perverted sense of their religion and justify themselves, wrap themselves in that religious cloak, we'll be dealing with it for a long, long time. Terrorism is a tragic fact. I think it's an immutable reality. But I think our country has gone from unprecedented grief to unprecedented guard. I think that's important to know. There's a former theater critic called Brooks Atkinson, and he once said, quote, "The most fatal illusion is a settled point of view." Like we know it all, and we'll just base whatever we do on what we know now. Well, times are changing, the nature of terrorism is changing, and that settled point of view is where danger finds sanctuary. Got to think anew, got to act anew. Times are changing, and our response has to change as well, because the nature of the threat has changed since 9/11. There's one thing I wish I could have changed had I had the opportunity to do so, but we really couldn't, because our response to the tragedy of 9/11, I think we mischaracterized it. And we still use the term today, and I believe it's inappropriate. It doesn't quite reflect the challenges that democracies have writ large. We said we're going to wage a war on terror. You can't wage a war against a tactic. Terrorism is a tactic. Terrorism has been used for centuries, maybe millennia. You don't know it, but there were a bunch of Brits back in UK in the 17th century trying to blow up Parliament. We think of the terrorism associated with the IRA in Ireland, political terrorism in Germany, sarin gas in the subways in Tokyo. And of course, you got the bombings at the embassies, and you got USS Cole, and you got the Blind Sheik in the World Trade Center. Terrorism is a tactic. We're not war against a tactic. We're at war against, and the conflict is with, a group of human beings wrap themselves in a perverted and distorted interpretation of a very reverent, disciplined religion. And they've wrapped themselves in the notion that it's perfectly all right to kill innocent people in order to advance a cause, and use terrorism to do it. And I think we need to understand that. Because you certainly need to know your enemy before you can defeat it. These are not man-made events. I frankly don't think we ought to view them as criminals. I did both prosecution work and defense work as a lawyer. Criminals have a different mindset. The objectives are different. They're not looking to promote societal change or political change. Their objectives are different. And by the way, I never met a criminal who was willing to die in the furtherance of the criminal enterprise. So we think the mindset, one, we're not a war against terror, we're a war against a belief system, and they're more than criminals. Because they can justify the killing of innocents, wrap themselves in a religious ideology that I think is a perversion of Islam, and their goals are entirely different. And we need to understand that. Excuse me. Terrorism itself, I'm going to tell you, is a violent, ever-changing force. It's a rather unique phenomenon. But please understand this. The fact that we cannot rationalize the notion of terrorism in a way that's consistent with our value system, with the Western world, doesn't mean that these individuals are not rational actors. They are. Their reasoning and their rationale is based on what they believe, not what we believe, what their culture is, what their interpretation is, not the Western world. We say, how can this be? Well, it is. They're rational in their thinking as it relates to their background, their culture, their religion. They're dynamic. They change. Richard Reed, the underwear bomber, I think maybe some of you recall that incident. Well, we know for a fact that obviously that failed, but the terrorists are looking for a different way to get explosives into the transportation system. They adjust. So they're a dynamic force, ever-changing force. They rationalize it according to their own objectives and goals. We should never diminish that. And we can't understand it and rationalize it in Western terms, but they can, and they will continue to do so. And one of the challenges I think we have, ladies and gentlemen, is to understand, and some people say, and maybe this is a bit of a miscalculation in terms of foreign policy, but democracy does not appeal to the radicals. I mean, we also need to understand that when people say, well, maybe we can convert them, it doesn't appeal. If you buy into this zealotry, if you buy into this belief system, here's what you believe. You believe that representative government, democracies at large, have empowered men and women to make decisions. And in their world, only God should direct human action. Humans should not direct human action. And it is hypocrisy. You are an infidel if you think your judgment is equivalent to or equal to that of God's. That's why their goal is Sharia. In their life, there's not separation of church and state. It's God's law that would mandate how you live, how you act, how you relate to one another. And that's not consistent to how democracies operate, but we need to understand that about these terrorists. Man-made laws. We are infidels, and we will be forever infidels. Now, they've been very clever. Some of these organizations have taken advantage, and they understand democracy, so they get elected in Egypt, and they get elected in the Gaza Strip. And then once they're elected, particularly in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been a long-time terrorist organization since 1920s and 30s, then they began to, technically under democracy, to eliminate opposition, become very intolerant of other religious beliefs. So they understand the value of democracy. They're even willing to buy into it as a temporary means to an end, because that's all terrorism is, a means to an end. A caliphate, a region or a globe that subscribes to the teachings of the Quran as they interpret it. It's tough for us to believe, but that's what they believe, and I think we need to understand that. And I think one of the challenges that we have, and we talk a little bit about security, is how do we, in the United States of America, accept the challenges confronted with this global scourge and meet those challenges in a way that's consistent with our value system, not theirs. We know what they're trying to do. Barbaric what ISIL's been doing. But Al-Qaeda has been doing that, not quite taking advantage of the social media. But when Al-Qaeda controlled certain areas in Iraq long before the surge, Al-Qaeda was responsible for the horror of 9/11. The notion that there's not much difference. One is a little bit more willing to wait for the caliphate, the other's moving much more aggressively. Don't think this. ISIL or ISIS is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. Now, they may be at odds right now. Zawahiri and Baghdadi might be a personal conflict. They have a slightly different view as to the world, the way they should try to influence events in the world. But at the end of the day, they both think Sharia law is the way to go. So we're going to be dealing with them for quite some time. And they take advantage of democratic institutions, as they have in several countries, but it also creates a real challenge for us. I think we're up to the challenge, don't get me wrong. But think about this for a moment. Think about the freedoms we take for granted. Freedom of speech. Here we are. I remember when I was running for governor, just an aside if you don't mind, an individual came up to me after paying like $250 for breakfast. Stale Danish, cold eggs, and lousy coffee. And after it was all over, he came up to me and he said, the only reason I bought a ticket was so I could tell you personally and do everything I possibly can to defeat you in your run for governor. I said, that's an interesting reason to buy a ticket. I said, well, there's two things, sir, you ought to know. He said, what's that? I said, well, here's what I appreciate about America. I'm an incumbent congressman. I'm running for governor. You're a citizen. You feel comfortable enough walking up to me in my face saying, I'm going to do everything I can to defeat you. And he kind of puffed up and he said, that's right. That's why I'm here. He said, what's the second thing you want to tell me? I said, sir, I don't need all the votes to win. Have a good day. You can do that in America. But they do take advantage of it. Whether it's in some of the religious settings. We have a very high threshold for speech. We don't condemn speech. We don't criminalize speech. Now, I guess if you could show that the speech actually incited an event that caused the death and destruction and actual harm, there might be something there. But freedom of speech, that's who we are. We're very tolerant, very diverse. And we know full well that in democracies around the world, there have been Muslim clerics who've been advocating the overthrow of government. Not necessarily with violence, but you know what the sub-message is. So they look at democracies and think freedom of speech, well, we could take advantage of that. Freedom of assembly, freedom of movement within the country, around the world. A lot of freedoms that we enjoy. And think about it in terms of, think about freedom of the press. Think about this massive, massive infrastructure that they use to send a message to their audience, those believers, to the targeted population, which might be the citizens of the United States and democracies and the world at large. We've got this massive infrastructure called press. And it's to their advantage to take advantage of it. Use the social media, Twitter accounts. Put beheadings on social media. Put burning victims on social media. At the end of the day, it's to strike fear, anxiety. Maybe push decision makers to move one way or another. Certainly move in a way that's consistent with their value system. We got an open press. We got free speech. It's not a vulnerability. It's a strength. We just have to realize when they're using it. I've often wondered, and there'll probably be some teachers here of journalism and speech. I've often wondered, how far should our media go? How far should the press go in taking what they've done on Twitter, taking what they've done on social media, and elevate it to the national audience? It's bad enough. I mean, I don't know. It is news, I grant it. But we're also getting their message. And the message to their followers is, look what we've done. Join us. The message to the targeted population is, we may keep doing this, so you ought to think about your relationship with us and our goals. And the message to the broader population is, we're tough, we're strong, we may be symmetric, we may be a small enterprise, but look what we've done to these democracies. Freedom of the press. How far do we go in being an extension of their public relations? And it's not willful, it's just who we are in this country. And I'm not into censorship. I'm glad I live in a country where there's freedom of press. What about privacy? Think about that. Not just with the Snowden enterprise, but think about this, the United States getting all kinds of metadata. They don't have the content of your phone conversation, but they know the number that you called, email address. They don't have the content. They know that. I, for one, listen, I want this government to be equipped with all the tools it needs to make us safer. But from my point of view, I don't think they need all the metadata. If you got a problem, I want a search warrant. I'm still a lawyer. You can get access to it. You got the FISA court. There have been some adjustments made in that process, and I'm glad. But think about privacy. I remember early on, as Secretary of Homeland Security, there was a lot of talk about the Patriot Act. A thoughtful woman came up to me and she said, Governor, I don't care if they listen into my phone calls. I'm not doing anything wrong. I said, ma'am, you should care. You're not doing anything wrong. The government has no business listening to your phone calls. So let's understand that. We do have a right of privacy in this country. There are ways we can get access to the information necessary to make us a little safer and more secure. It has been done in the past, it can be done in the future. But think about that for a moment. We are a democracy. We appreciate the right of privacy. We have to protect that. And there are ways they can get access to that information, I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that can help keep us safer and more secure. Due process. Think about that. I told the group last night, and if they're here, forgive me, but I'm going to mention it to the audience. My counterpart in Germany, remember, this is the brand. We're talking freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, privacy, all these marvelous freedoms that we have in this country. We're not prepared, to paraphrase Ben Franklin, if you give up liberty in case of security, maybe you don't need it either. We shouldn't be prepared to surrender these. But the Minister of Interior has the equivalent of Homeland Security in Germany. He and I were talking one night about Guantanamo. Big issue. President Obama wants to close Guantanamo. I don't think you need to close Guantanamo because I don't think that was ever the problem. You may or may not like what I'm going to have to say, but I got to say it anyhow because that's what I think. I'm a private citizen, freedom of speech. I just got done talking about it. The problem wasn't Guantanamo in my conversation with Otto Schilep, and he and I were like mine. He was a lawyer and a very pro-American lawyer who had represented political terrorists in Germany in the 60s and 70s. So he understood the nature of terrorism. But during the conversation that he said, Tom, it's not Guantanamo that creates the anxiety and the disappointment in the broader global audience. It's the notion that Americans would keep people there forever without some form of adjudication. So it wasn't the location, and he was right, it was the adjudication. Are you going to pick people up and put them on that piece of desolate rock and keep them there forever? Or is there going to be a tribunal that says, consistent with the American values, consistent with our Constitution, consistent with our brand, consistent with the rule of law, do they get some form of due process? Now, ironically, in the United States of America, we are our greatest cheerleaders and we're also our strongest critics. And the legal profession and others within the broader community said that's not enough. They deserve to have some kind of adjudication. By the way, a friend of mine was involved initially in setting up Guantanamo and doing some of the interrogation. He said, Tom, some of those people I'd never let out of that place ever under any circumstances. He said, some of them, I think, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I said to you earlier in my remarks, I don't think they're criminals. I think we ought to treat them as terrorists. I think there's a way we can give them due process, an independent tribunal. The rules of evidence have to be transparent, but they got to be a little bit different because some of our sources and methods dealing with them are different. We don't necessarily want the rest of the world, particularly the terrorists, to know how we extract and how we get information, particularly technologically and elsewhere. And I say that to you because I don't think closing Guantanamo has ever been the problem. It was a political promise that the president made, so be it if you want to live on the promise. But I think the objection that the broader community of nations had was that, America, you're not acting in a way that's consistent with your brand. And whether we like it or not, that's how we project ourselves, and I think we should never, ever look not to be projected as a little bit different. Because due process is important to us. And they're not criminals. So I'm not prepared to give them Miranda warnings, but I am prepared to give them counsel, an independent tribunal, transparent rule of evidence, and then we'll see what happens. So as far as I'm concerned, keep it open. We may need it in the future. I don't think we necessarily need to bring them to the United States. Those are some of the challenges associated with a great country like ours trying to deal with an enemy who doesn't operate from with the same mindset, the same rules of engagement. It creates some security problems for us, but as I told you before, I think we're certainly up to dealing with it in a meaningful way. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one other issue, and I think it's important to talk about how we go about ultimately diffusing or minimizing the challenges before us. First of all, I think it requires great leadership from the United States of America, from the president on down. We all have different opinions as to this president's philosophy in terms of global engagement. I'm not here to talk about that. But I am here to remind young people and all of us that when we go in to vote for the president of the United States, more often than not, and I think it's predictable and I certainly think it's understandable, we'll take a look at the situation at home, whatever that might be. Unemployment, lack of opportunity, environmental problems, and say, we want somebody who can address these problems here at home, and all for that. But our president is multitasked. Whether we like it or not, our president is still viewed as the leader of the free world, of democracies around the world, and both our friends and our enemies expect our president to be engaged. This president, for reasons of philosophy, is not as engaged as I'd like him to be, so I'm not here to talk about that. But when we vote for president in the 21st century particularly, and I've seen it in my side of the aisle, and the Republican side of the aisle, sometimes we want to be political isolationists. We want to pull back. Fortress America. Wrong. On the Democrat side of the aisle, sometimes they want to pull back. Economic fortress of America. The 21st century, we are hyper-connected. We are super interdependent. And nobody can convince me that it's in America's best interest to be less connected economically and less connected geopolitically than not. And so when we vote for that individual to lead us, I think not in terms of what are their alternatives to the challenges of solving the problems we have in the United States. That's true. It's legit. We need to think about it. But whose philosophy is consistent with America being more engaged in the world, not less? And that doesn't necessarily mean military all the time. Frankly, there are three ways you can affect foreign affairs. You have the military, you have diplomacy, and I'm a big believer in foreign aid, and that's an entirely another story. Next to executive pay, when you talk about foreign aid, everybody gets all excited about that. I think it's too bad. Because one of the reasons that organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah have been so successful, and they are terrorist organizations being funded by Iran, but one of the reasons they're so successful is they have a military arm, they've got a political arm, and they've got a social welfare arm. And any organization that helps any community meet its human needs, healthcare, education, whatever it is, there'll be a natural inclination, not necessarily to advocate, but to accept. So I'm a strong believer that you deal with these foreign challenges, geopolitically, militarily, yes. I'd have dealt with Syria, and I would have dealt it differently. But that's not the reason I'm just saying, I don't want to get into that space right now. But we elect presidents not only to solve political problems at home and economic problems, but to help lead democracies. It's an expectation, whether we like it or not. Now, there are a couple of things we need to do to diminish the threat. One is, what's the motivation? They have motivation and capabilities. What's the motivation? One of the things we haven't been very good at as a country for the past 10, 15 years, particularly since 9/11, under both administrations, we've not aroused the general Muslim community and Muslim leaders around the world, political and religious, to remind the rest of the Muslim population that there's nothing that the extremists do that suggests that they're looking for a better day for any other citizen. Sharia law, remember there's not a word in Arabic for democracy. And Sharia law is inconsistent with all the values we hold. But there is no population that's ever been subjugated to Sharia law, whether it's Al-Qaeda, ISIL, or any of the others, where they have fared better long term. So it's not about a better lifestyle. It's not about better education. It's not about the modern world. The only thing they accepted in the modern world is technology, and they're pretty smart. They've learned how to use that. So we need somehow to convince the broader Muslim community that, one, there's nothing under this principle of governance, a caliphate, that suggests that you'll be better off in any manner, shape, or form. By the way, there's no equality under Sharia law is fine if you're one of the chosen ones, but if you're a slave, an infidel, or a woman, that does not include in their definition of equality. So it doesn't mean anything for you. And secondly, they've killed more Muslims than non-Muslims. So we have to get at the roots. We've got to deal with the motivation. Then the operational capability, that's military, that's counterterrorism, that's law intelligence, many, many factions. But there's two ways you can begin influencing that. We get decent marks in some areas, not so decent marks, but it's a continuing challenge we have to undermine the appeal of this zealotry, the appeal of this belief system. And then, of course, unfortunately, we got to deal with intelligence and law enforcement and strike at their capabilities. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about state-sponsored terrorism, and to that extent, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Iran and the nuclear deal, and this is my opinion, but I've followed it for a long time. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, every morning when I was in the White House or as secretary, I got what we called a threat matrix. Some days it was a couple pages, some days it was a couple dozen pages. And I have enormous gratitude for anybody who wants to be the President of the United States, because I just saw the threats directed at the United States of America and our interests domestically and overseas from terrorist organizations, let alone all the other issues that presidents have to deal with, from China and Russia and everybody else. So I just got a small slice of that. We're a target. We've been a target for a long time. Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and the rest of those. But there's another form of terrorism that is as virulent, that creates as many problems for this country and national security, and that's state-sponsored terrorism. And one of my great concerns about the nuclear deal with Iran, and it's going to pass. Somebody asked me when I was in Israel, said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, first of all, I disagree with my president, but he is my president. And it's going to pass in a way that's consistent with our Constitution. So that's the way it is. So that's the new reality." But why do I think it's a bad deal? Because we're going to give them a signing bonus over $100 billion immediately. We're going to rebuild their energy infrastructure immediately. Khamenei would be for a college graduating class a couple months ago, said to the graduates, "We need cyber warriors." By the way, they got a pretty good infrastructure to conduct cyber warfare. I suspect he'll build a bigger infrastructure with this money. So it's that piece of it. There's nothing in our relationship with them since '79 suggests we can trust them. We're never going to get into their military facilities. That's been blocked off. There's a firewall. And do anybody really think that after the Russians, the Chinese, the Germans, the French, and the British have invested over the next couple of years, that sanctions are going to snap back? Do you think Putin and President Xi will get together after the first transgression, the first breach of the covenant to say, the mullahs shouldn't have done that, Rouhani shouldn't have done that, they breached it, let's impose the sanctions. You may believe that they'll do that. I don't believe that they'll do that. But it is the reality. That's what's going to happen. And so you're going to see more activity. I mean, it was estimated that Hezbollah alone in southern Lebanon gets 10 or 15 billion a year from the Iranians, let alone Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. So when we think of terrorism, we think of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, but state-sponsored terrorism, and I'm using Iran as an example. It's the primary example. What I'm saying is create challenge to us and our security in many different ways. We're just going to have to accept this new reality with an emerging Iran, funding more and more terrorist organizations, and deal with it. Now, I'm not breathless about this, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're a pretty resilient country. I think we've demonstrated that time and time again. We're not perfect. I talk about America being an exceptional country. By no means does that mean we're perfect. We made mistakes. Hopefully we learn by most of our mistakes and do better the next time. I didn't sleep much in the White House, but I slept well when I was in the White House or secretary, because I knew what was going on outside the White House. I knew we were engaging. We created the department. We said we've got to manage this risk. We've got to engage our partners at the state and local level. We've got to have more and better and stronger ties with the law enforcement community and the intelligence community around the world. We need to share information. We had to know from a need to know to a need to share. We need to get that information to state and locals. I saw all these things developing. And I saw hundreds of thousands of people every day and every night in the United States and elsewhere doing everything they could to make all of us safer, to do everything they possibly can to be ready for the next attack. We've been very lucky on a couple of occasions. But we can never say to you, no administration, no Secretary of Homeland Security could ever say to this assembled audience of 300 million Americans, we got it under control. It's not going to happen again. It will happen again. We will deal with it when it does, hopefully stronger after it happens. But every day we get stronger and smarter in terms of protecting our interest, our security, and our freedoms. So we're not going to compromise our value system. We're not going to compromise who we are as a country, because when we do that, they start to win. If they affect how we treat one another, our relationship with government, they start chipping it away at our freedoms to adjust to them, they begin to win, and they're not going to win. Why? Because Americans don't live in fear. Not in our DNA. We live in freedom. And nobody, none of these terrorist organizations will ever take that from us. Thank you very, very much. Great being with you.